Right. One thing I have to say, actually point out, is that it all looks a little off kilter because the room is really wonky. So there's no So actually, the top is straight, but the bottom is not because the room's
So the show was straight. Like
The
show
sh-
was.
Straight from this angle.
good. That's the
Excellent,
letterbox
excellent.
thing. But yeah, hanging shows in this room, and the whole place is crazy because everything's on a slide. So don't you can't put a ball down or anything like that because it just falls away.
Okay.
Or pen.
No circular sculpture.
So how are we going to communicate for me
I'll
to
just
move this
say
on?
next slide.
Next slide. I like that. That's
Yeah.
good. Classy. We're ready.
Okay. So next slide. I really love this. So this is a poster, and Tate put them in Pimlico Station, but they always put them next to this bin bag, and I really love it because it just makes everything look trashy straight away, which is not what they want, but I really enjoy it. So we can hold on this one and go to the next couple if you want, but if it comes to text, go back, so I'm saving the text. So there's like 3 boring images you can look at while I chat about the beginning. So, why Women in Revolt? So there's a few reasons why I made the exhibition, and the first is that I wanted to make a gift for my mother. So my mum passed away in 2020, and which was not supposed to happen. And she was a working class woman, she was from a working class family, she was a nurse, she worked as an unpaid carer for her partner. She had her pension stolen by the government when they moved the pensions age. She was supposed to be women, so she died before she got her pension. I'm pretty sure her cancer would have been noticed if she hadn't had a male doctor who took her seriously. And she had really, really bad taste in men that really affected her life across the years, because she would fall for these just terrible men and would give all her energy to them. And so, but she was amazing, hilarious, beautiful, left-wing, just like the baddest. She was so amazing. And so I think if you're a single daughter, oh, Bruce! He's like, oh yeah, she was great. I liked her, yeah. I think if you're a daughter who grows up with a single mother, I think that's a really intense and amazing relationship. And it kind of does something to your view of the world. So I grew up knowing that women were in charge. Like, naturally, like women are in charge of everything. And then you come of age and you get a job and you go to work and men try and tell you what to do, and it's like absolutely shocking because you've grown up in this like matriarchal environment, which is so amazing and positive and loving and nurturing, and then you're in this like manosphere of bullshit. And I wanted to make something that celebrated not just my mum. So mum knew about the show. She died before it opened, but she knew it was happening and she knew it was dedicated to her. But I wanted to make something that was about all of those post-war women who have made my generation's life so much easier by, even if they weren't like, sick anywhere, even if they weren't, out in the streets marching, which my mum didn't, by the very fact of like having a job, of kind of getting up every day, they were living this life that meant that I could do things differently. And then the others are related to work. So I got into this industry in Scotland, where I'm from, and then I joined the British Council, which is nuts, and then I started working at Tate in 2016, and that was funny. That was a huge culture shock. I don't know why they employed me. I think it was probably an accident, but I was never a good fit with the organisation, because what they want, I think, is people who will maintain a narrative, people who went to a certain school, look a certain way, can talk a certain way, and can perpetuate this, whatever they say. I think that's actually what they want. So I found it a really challenging place to be, and particularly because the collection, I couldn't tell any stories I wanted to tell in the collection. I remember early on, they asked me to curate a room in the collection display about was it the 80s? And I basically used everything that I could find that was interesting in one room. So like Rotimi Kayode, Sonal Gupta, General Idea. There was a small group of artists I could bring together to talk about an alternative kind of 80s, but that was sort of it. That has really changed in the last 10 years, or 8.5 years that I was there. There's a lot more work in the collection that is representative of diverse experience, but it wasn't there. And the other thing that I realised was that my job title was Curator of British Contemporary Art, but I didn't know about British art. I knew about male British art, didn't know about women's British art. And I think if you're taught history of art in the UK, or certainly I graduated in 2004 from my undergraduate, you hear about Barbara Hepworth, then there's a massive gap, then you hear about Tracy Emin, and there's nothing else. There's absolutely nothing else. And you're taught a little bit about American feminism, but very little, and the kind of big names. And they just sort of, I think they don't know either that these histories had taken place. And it's all kind of tied in because me and my mum had lived in London in the 80s, and she had worked at the front line of the AIDS epidemic, and I remember her explaining to me what squat was, and I remember seeing the poll tax riots when I was really little. And so I'm thinking, okay, you've got all of this stuff happening, women must have made work about it, it simply must be there. So that was really the journey, was to try, for my own sanity, to create a history of art that we could share with the general public that was about a working class woman's experience. So, I wonder if I should do the slide first. No, we'll talk about this first. So, the kind of key points to keep in mind about the show is that it covers, because it's still on, it's on in Edinburgh at the moment, then it's going to Manchester. It covers 1970 to 1990, so from the beginning of the women's liberation movement in the UK to the end of the Thatcher administration. And Thatcher is really the kind of ghost of the whole show, ghost of most of our lives, of course, but is, you know, certainly there through the whole show. Initially, I thought about the dates being 1970 to 1985 because Griselda Pollock and Risible Parker wrote a book called Framing Feminism that was released in '88 that was about that period. But the criticism it got at the time was that that they didn't look enough at women of colour who were making work, and as we'll go into later, that does appear at a later date, so I wanted to extend those dates to get a greater representation of women of colour, and also so we could look at Section 28 in the AIDS epidemic, because that to me feels utterly crucial in British history. Other key thing is that it's told from an intersectional socialist feminist perspective that in itself obscures elements of feminist history. So this is not ever and was never intended to be an encyclopedia. It's a very, very subjective view of British life and of what is interesting. So one of my advisors, Griselda Pollock, we had quite a lot of arguments because she is a very theoretical feminist and I'm not. I like meat and blood and guts and fanzines and all that kind of stuff. And there were things that she definitely thought I'd left out, but that just interest me less. And I think they are often works that have been appreciated by museums already. So, you know, people like Susan Hiller, people like Mary Kelly. I think because of the conceptualism, you find that museum collections happen more. So I wanted to look at the people like Alison, who really had not set foot in the museum before. It had a chronological time frame. That was something I thought about for years, going back and forward with these floor plans. Should it be thematic? Should it be chronological? And actually, in the end, it was quite straightforward that it should be chronological, though I think it's harder to do. And the reason I did it chronologically is because, to me, the politics is as important as the fine art. And that allows you to trace them next to each other, and I think it's more generous in giving people a kind of foothold to work with. Also, it's really hardcore because it shows how racist the UK is. So if you have a proper chronological hang, you don't have work by feminist women of colour until 1979. And I got quite a lot of stick for that, people saying, why aren't there women of colour until that late on? And it's like, Britain's racist, that's why. Which obviously I didn't say in an interview, well I did, but it was a really complicated site for women of colour to be making work in, and so it appears later. So yeah, that's why we have that time frame. Constellations, not stars. So one of the many things about institutions that drives me nuts is that they like to celebrate scarcity, and it's this really like capitalist way of kind of going, actually that's the thing that's important, that's the thing that has financial value. So you'll have noticed it with the mainstream's resurgence of interest in the work of artists of colour. There's been a tendency to really focus on 2 or 3 people and to the exclusion of all the incredible work that was going on around them. So someone like Levena Himid, who is the most extraordinary artist, activist, curator, she has spent her whole life trying to raise up the visibility of her friends. But then what the institution does is go, no, we just want to look at Levena. widen that lens. So we wanted to look at, in the spirit of the way Levena worked, which was she used to just write to people and knack them and be like, be in this show, and she would really like hound them until they gave in this wonderful way. We wanted to do that, to look at a constellation of women and not have this hierarchical thing. So one of my bosses and the press team kept saying at the beginning, you know, who are the stars that we can talk about? And it's like, there aren't any. But that's also because we haven't made any. You know, we've ignored these women, which is why they aren't household names now. Interpretation was a really key thing. With this show, I knew it would be the last show I would do at Tate, and I know they won't do a show like this again. So I really tried to push everything as far as I could, everything across every aspect. Also, it was very much a kind of grief therapy, so you're going a bit mad and you just kind of do all the things. But interpretation was something that was really key. So one of my best friends at the gallery is a woman called Sam, who comes from a mining family and is like hardcore unionist, is head of our union, is totally brilliant, and she's also the interpretation curator. And we worked together, or she wrote most of it, to push the interpretation as far as we could to the left, but also to talk about the complicity of the institution in hiding these women and in kind of, you know, messing with markets and things like that. So I'm quite proud of the interpretation because I think it's really, it was quite stark in the way it talked about things. Didn't sugarcoat anything. Art history and political history are given equal billing through the whole thing. There are approximately 139 artists in the original show. That the Scotland and Manchester versions are slightly edited because of the space. But we don't know the exact number because some of the collectives, it's still hard to work out exactly who is in them. So that's individuals and collectives. And across the piece, there is the largest show Tate Britain have ever done. So there was about 350 artworks and about 350 archival materials. This is amazing. So none of the archive came from Tate, and 11 of the artworks came from Tate's collection, which is absolutely shocking. And that has changed a bit. We bought quite a lot during the show, but not enough. And I would also say that the archival situation has changed because Levena Himid has donated her archive now, and Maud Salter's archive has been donated, which are extraordinarily rich. So if you were to make the show now, a lot of that material would be there. But I was utterly reliant on the generosity of places like Glasgow Women's Library, the Feminist Library, Black Cultural Archives. And that in itself is a really complex thing because they are organisations that often have very little trust in Tate. And so across the piece there was a whole lot of trust building, and that's something I think the institutions still don't understand, how complex that was. But I'm very proud that all of those lenders supported with some we'll talk about some of them in a minute, some really special objects. Finally, on the design was really important to me. Tate don't normally work with designers, but I insisted, and I kind of basically said I can't manage this amount of material without a designer because it's too overwhelming and complex. So I worked with two designers I really trust, and we really looked to the time. So what I wanted to do was to respect the community centres, the libraries, the exhibitions and houses, all of that stuff. Not make a pastiche of it, but also not institutionalise it, because I think Tate often have a way of making everything look the same, and I didn't want that branding. I wanted it to feel like they couldn't own it, they couldn't control it. So they being Tate, not the artists. So you'll see, we'll look at some images later on, but we used quite humble materials that could all be recycled, of course in the spirit of the women in the show, and we used materials like, so this grey stuff is a thing called sandala board, which is what they use in GP surgery. So it's like a pressed cardboard. So that aesthetic is really of a kind of municipal GLC kind of situation. Boring for many people, I'm sure, but all the interpretation was printed on paper. It's quite often printed on plastic, and we were just trying every minute to pull back the kind of ecological footprint of the show. And a really important thing was that there was no pink. So again, institutions like to go, feminist show, pink, woo! And I love pink, I'm wearing pink, but it didn't have a place in this. Also, the merch for the shop, that was a really big deal because again, I had this hilarious meeting with the merch team, and we sat down and they said,
we've got this big presentation, we're going to put you through everything. And I was like, okay, so just before we start, let me remind you, I said, no boobs, no pink, no like boss bitch stuff. And then she had watched her like delete 10 pages of her PowerPoint. And in the end, I think it was pretty good. We had a really quite pared back. Like, I love the Barbican, but some of their feminist shows have the weirdest kind of merch alongside them. Okay, in terms of timeline for the kind of curatorial nerds, it's interesting, I think. So I pitched it in 2017. I was researching it from like 2017 to 2019 and like working out, you know, you have to go through lots of review sessions with the director and blah, 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 and go through all of that. And then it was approved, I think it was approved for my mum. We had to move back to Scotland to look after my mum, and it was approved in 2019. And then she passed away, COVID happened, and I really started studio visits again online at the end of 20. And then right up, that's all I did for 20 till it opened in 23. And then we made the publication in the summer, which was intense, and the podcast and the record. So you have this long period of research and then this really kind of fast period of output. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are my two favourite reviews of the show. We got an insane amount of press. So the Tate kept saying, oh, you're going to get, I think they said 82,000 visitors, and I was like, babes, no, like, I promise you this is going to be a very busy show. And they were like, oh, that's cute, but it's not. And we kept having a fight about it, and in the end it was 145,000, and it was like absolutely mobbed and sold out at the weekends. And it got a huge amount of press, but these are my two favourites. So Alistair Sooke, chief art critic at the Tory Graph, and aggressively political triumph of conviction over talent, 2 stars. And the next slide please. Tate has mustered hundreds of works so minor and often puerile or even hate-fueled that it's extraordinary to encounter them in a museum, which was Jackie Volschlager for the Financial Times, and who wrote a brilliant book on Goya, and I was really disappointed that she didn't like it. But I like to show those reviews because I think it's really important that we understand, that it's understood how radical a show like this was, which is insane because it's 2024. But this show terrified a lot of the establishment because it undermined what they had been building, and this narrative, this like white, male, pale, stale, colonial art history, these culture wars, all of these things have been maintained by journalists like this. And actually Jackie, I really like Jackie, but her review is actually quite frightening. You should look it out because there's a wonderful woman in the show called Huria Niati who made this painting about the Algerian war and about violence in Algeria. And she mentions in the label that she was referencing Delacroix. And Jackie loses her shit over this in the interview and basically says, it's overtly racist what she says about, you know, this woman, how dare she say that she is, you know, in the same space as Delacroix, which just kind of blows my mind that anyone would say that, because why? And that, you know, anyway. But they're really interesting reads just to see how scared people are of things changing. Okay, so yeah. So we're going to go into the floor plan soon, and I'll kind of talk you through things. Could you go 2 more slides for me? 1 more? Okay, great. So, another kind of quick overview is thinking about the methodology for the show. So, this is kind of what I've worked out afterwards. At the time I was just doing it really instinctively, with a few rules in my head, but I kind of worked out afterwards kind of what this methodology might have been and how we might apply it to future things. So, one of the key things was taking time and building relationships. So, rather than this kind of extractive thing, being like, I'm from the Tate, can I have this and this and this? It was really about going to people's houses, looking under their beds, having a chat, going back again, you know, really spending time with people. And not just artists, there's archives, so making sure I spend time with, you know, Black Cultural Archive, all those different spaces, learning from that stuff. Because of course, the only reason we can access this work is because a small amount of women have safeguarded it for the last 20, 30 years, and they are the ones that need to be celebrated and talked about, and they were credited in the show. Interestingly, again, with the travel, I was trying to explain to my boss why I needed a certain amount of money to go around the UK, not like New York or Fiji. Like, can I go to Wolverhampton and talk to this artist? And they wouldn't give me, they gave me 500 quid for 3 years of travel in the UK. And they just didn't give a shit. Whatever argument I used, they just didn't care. So I ended up going to the Jonathan Ruffer and they gave me $4 grand because they understood that that's how you do research, is you go somewhere and you read and you listen and you talk. And I did manage to get payment for advisors. So we got 3 paid advisors and I got them in early because I've watched other shows happen where they bring an advisor in really late and then they can't implement any of the stuff they say. It's totally useless and it's embarrassing for the advisor. So we got them in 2 years before and we paid Griselda Pollock, Althea Cullen, who runs the Women's Library, and Marlene Smith to be advisors. And I would meet them every 6 months and kind of show them what I was doing and they would tell me good, bad, no, yes, got that wrong. And we had that time to kind of implement. I also really tactically used them because I could see, certainly after COVID, like that my boss wanted to cancel the show or certainly move it or keep moving it, you know, that kind of thing. We can get something out of the way. And it's really hard to do that when Griselda Pollock's at the end of the Zoom call because she's absolutely terrifying. So I kind of knew that where he could say no to me, he couldn't say no to those 3 women. So it was a kind of buffer. And they knew that as well. They knew it was happening. Crediting, so as I mentioned before, it was really important to credit as much as possible, credit individuals, credit archives, and make sure that we were never saying that we have found this work, because of course that's a nonsense, and it's this really kind of tedious colonial thing that institutions do. You know, we rediscover artists, and it's like they were always there, you just weren't looking at them. Like, it's just about, you know, that. We spent money really consciously, so I really wanted to challenge some of the modes of working in the institution. Some worked, some failed. I tried to get money early so that we could do conservation work, but like the computer said no and I couldn't get it. So we ended up doing all our conservation work quite late in the day, which was really annoying, but anyway. However, the conservation work, so normally at Tate, you take down loads of walls and reconfigure them and, you know, make each show look really fancy. And I didn't want to do that because it's, you know, waste of material, it's waste of effort, energy, all of those things. I had to move a couple of walls, but I really limited it. So the money we saved there, I ended up spending on conservation of artworks. So we spent about £200,000 conserving artworks, which is amazing because it means you're paying an independent conservator and you're also giving that back to the artist as something they can use or sell or, you know, or is saved for us. So that felt really good. And yeah, thinking about the ecological impact of transport, building and design materials is really important all the way through. And then also kind of constantly acknowledging the limitations and privileges of this curatorial position and kind of making sure people knew that there are so many emissions in this show, but it is what it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so actually no, maybe go back to that one for a sec, please, thank you. So, as I say, I wanted to really push everything as far as I could, so I really like the title. So this room is called Rising with Fury, it's the first room you went into, and it is, Rising with Fury is from a quote by Monica Hu, and it was a little pamphlet she made, and it said, "Women are the real left, and they were rising with a fury greater than any in history. This time we will succeed or no one will survive." And that was really the vibe I wanted for this room, of just like this explosion of activism, of anger, of kind of connecting to each other. So it opens right at 1970. So this painting by Maureen Scott was painted in 1970. Maureen is an incredible artist who was kind of talks very openly about her struggles, her mental health struggles. She was in and out of the Bethlehem Royal in London. This painting is in the Bethlehem collection, and it's called Mother and Child at Breaking Point. So obviously this child screaming, kind of getting away from her. If anyone can remember the photograph this references, I'm really grateful because I'm trying to write about it at the moment. But it's some like, you know, realist war photographer who, not war, like inner city photographer who was taking this, and she'd painted it. Maureen was had co-founded the League of Socialist Artists in Peckham in London, and this like incredible kind of radical figure. There's a book about that socialist work coming out soon. And I really wanted, throughout the whole exhibition, I wanted there to be an atmosphere. I wanted it to feel like you were having a night in with your best friends, all women, and you had a glass of wine, and that thing that we all know happens where the conversation is about politics, it's about love, it's about sex, it's about ecology, it's about all those things. You have a cry, you know, it's just like all over the place, but it's amazing and it's your favourite space. That's kind of what I wanted it to feel like. And so this 1970 moment, the interpretation in this room talked about the fact that, you know, there is no Equal Pay Act at this time, your husband can legally rape you until 1991, you could still advertise at this time for jobs that said like, you know, good looking secretary wanted. It's just a shit show for women, an absolute shit show. And also women are of course having children younger and getting married younger and kind of getting into this situation, which is so little talked about. You know, motherhood is often talked about as such an amazing, joyful thing, and I think a lot of women don't always experience that. So I wanted this, her gaze to be the thing that got you when you came in. And to the left in this first room, there's some photographs from the Miss World, not Miss World, from the first Women's Liberation Conference in Oxford in 1970, and then a painting in the corner there by Monica Shu, this great painting called Phallic Culture. The first room was a bit of a mess, and that really bothered me for quite a long time. And then I realised that actually the reason I couldn't get it to hold together was because a lot of these women didn't know each other, a lot of the work was very different, it was all kind of arriving at one moment, and of course things were disparate, you know, so I kind of went with it. To the back, there's a kind of small section on performance work, so kind of verse English and others. Next slide, please. A really key thing in this first room was looking at the Postal Art Group. So Postal Art Group, and this is something that really needs the credit of Amy Tobin. So Amy Tobin, the curator, amazing young woman who works in Cambridge. And she had done a project at Raven Row where she worked on a show that Kate Walker and other artists had done and really brought it back into the attention of people. And so, okay, so you've got an artist called Kate Walker who lives in Camberwell, and her friend moves away, lives on the same road and moves away, Sally Gollop, and they start to post things to each other. So they make objects at the kitchen table, put them in an envelope and post them around. So all of these would have been posted. And then in 1975, Kate Walker goes to the Feminist Art Conference and she stands up and says, look, would anyone like to join us? We've started this project, it feels kind of exciting. And loads of other women get involved, one of whom is Sue Richardson, who we'll see later. And they start to post these things all over the world, and then they have shows all around the UK, and it actually goes to the ICA. That's a really interesting thing, and I didn't have enough time to go into it in the show really, which is a shame, but to think about how neglectful places like Tate were to this art. So, you know, centre of London, ICA is like a minute away by bike. You've got Brixton Art Gallery across the river, you've got Elbow Room, you've got the Africa Centre, you've got all of this stuff that surrounded Tate, and they just pretended it wasn't happening. They were just like, oh my god. So these hadn't been shown for years and years and years, but because Amy Tobin had started to do research and open the cupboards, and a woman called Alexandra Coley, by the time I got to these artists, they had found them. So yeah, really exciting to have these postal artworks out. Next slide, please. I haven't got a pointer, but there's kind of drawings on this wall here. There's over here, you've got Margaret Harrison and Penny Slinger, and they're quite important. They're quite important because Margaret Harrison. Actually, we'll go back a bit. So, Monica Shu painted a painting called God Giving Birth in 1968, which is a painting of a woman of colour giving birth. And it was so controversial that every time it was shown, the police report it was confiscated, it was always causing a ruckus. And she showed it in St Ives, and the mayor of St Ives, I just lost his mind, I can't remember what happened, but it was really scary for her, that St Ives moment in particular. And she wrote in her diaries that she would never work alone again. She was so kind of troubled by that experience that she would work with other women. And how that relates to those things I just pointed out. That Margaret Harrison, who who was co-founder of the Feminists Art Group, working in the Women's Arts Union, absolute badass, painted this series of works, or the drawings, and they're kind of overtly sexualized, but for the 1970s, images of women. So kind of lying on a banana wearing lingerie. There's one of Hugh Hefner dressed as a Playboy bunny. There's some strap-ons, you know, there's some like sexualized images, but they're all drawings. And when she showed it in 1971, the police were called and the exhibition was shut down. And the other ones I pointed out are kind of a few of the tiny remnants that remain of this incredible looking show by Penny Slinger, which was at Flowers Gallery in 1973, where she was thinking about the bride, what it is to be married, what it is to be a bride, and really taking the piss out of it. And those photographs are her in a dress made of a cake, and they're like slices cut out, and her genitals are covered with flowers or lips, so these collaged images. And again, the police were called, the show was shut down. And that was the level of kind of, you know, oppression of women artists, oppression of women by the police at that time. Next slide, please. Different view of that. These drawings actually, the big drawings on the right, they're by the amazing Monica Ross, who, of course, her daughter and Bernard at the studio, over the road, and was one of the most influential artists of that time. Next slide, please. This is just so thinking about the way the chronology worked. That first room went from about kind of 1970 when we entered to about 1975-6, so thinking about the what's it called, Equal Pay Act. What I was talking about before, the fact that there weren't women artists, there weren't feminist works by artists of colour until 79. Of course, there was extraordinary activism by women of colour for generations before. So what we sought to do was to really highlight that activism wherever we could. So you'll see here there's pictures of Jaibin Desai in the corner above that screen, who of course headed up the Grunwick strikes, and they're taken by Format Photographers Agency. So thinking about women of colour who were hugely inspirational to the artists who were then coming through, and also just to acknowledge that all of the photographs in the show were taken by women, so there was no male gaze in the show, and they were all taken by either the artist or by Format Photographers Agency, so the commercial photographers agency. I just didn't want men anywhere near it. And it's really fascinating if you go to the Format archive in Bishopsgate, because you see British history through a feminist lens, because of course women went to the things they wanted to photograph and the kind of causes they were interested in, so it's just really, really fascinating. Next slide, please. So the Marxist housewife still does the housework is, next slide please, a bastardization of a title by, I've forgotten her name, Alexis Hunter, who also lived, does she live in Brighton? Her sister lives in Brighton. No, Alexis Hunter's sister. And I wanted to think about the home. So this is about 1975 to about 1978, 78. I wanted to think about the home, but I wanted to think about it as a site of rebellion, destruction. I wanted to think about motherhood, but also not having kids because you don't want them or you can't have them. It was, I had too many things going on in here. It could have been a whole show on its own, but I didn't want it to be predictable, I think. And there was some choices I made. So a lot of people that I spoke to expected Mary Kelly's postpartum document to be in this room, which of course is a work that Tate owns, or a section of it, where she's charting the kind of developmental process of her child. But it takes up 8 meters, and I kind of wasn't prepared to give one person 8 meters in the show, so I used this amazing video called Antepartum, which actually is in Brighton Collection, which is her pregnant belly and the baby kicking. It's gorgeous work. And I swapped the wall it's going to be on, I gave to Cozy Fanny Tutti. So I really wanted it all the way through, not to just go with those things you're told, so like Cozy's punk, so she goes there, or this person's that. I wanted to mix it up. And Cozy's early performance work, I think, is absolutely mind-blowing. So we had this big work that's never been shown before called Women's Role that was in that space. Anyway, these two works I think are really indicative of the vibe of the show. So the video is a film called Birthrights, which was made by Rabina Rose. That you couldn't see that before we got to it. We had to have it totally digitally remastered, which is amazing because that's money well spent.
you can see it again. And it's an hour-long film of a home birth. She was really into the home birth movement, and I wanted very much to think about the non-medication of women's bodies and the medicalisation, and think about those more organic kind of natural spaces that maybe, you know, people like Joe Spence would have explored for good or for bad, and thinking about cancer therapy, but also, you know, women who were looking at natural birth. And what I loved about this work was if you were in the other room before you got in, her screams kind of sounded orgasmic, and you would be so if you were in the first room, you would hear these cries and be like, what the hell is that? And then you got through maybe expecting something erotic, and it was just like, home birth! Like blood and guts kind of everywhere. And then the work next to it was really lovely. So Janice Jeffries, the textile artist, she'd come to see me, and she was incredibly generous with like giving me these original copies of magazines and things. She'd clearly been really heavily involved in the movement. But when I asked her what I could show of her, she was like, oh, I don't think I've got anything, you know, it's fine, don't worry about it. And I was like, come on, you must have something. And she said, well, I don't think I've got anything unless you count the 2-meter high sisal carpet dyed blood red labia. And I was like, yeah, no, that's absolutely perfect. So that's her gorgeous labia. Next slide. And of course, archive was super important. So yeah, archive in every room, crammed it in every room, and really kept it as intersectional as possible. So this is a room about the home and about childcare, and there's that's a spare rib tea towel that was owned by Joe Spence. So Joe Spence made those burn marks. So yeah, it's actually quite a good example, this one. So it's about the home that you've got, you know, women bite back, it's shit getting married. This is a book by Erin Pizzey about domestic violence, communism in the family, and then FOAD. So FOAD was the journal of the Organisation of Asian and African Descent. So, and then it was looking at the care of children of colour within the community. So yeah, really trying to keep it intersectional. Next slide, please. Am I going on too much? No. Okay. Please tell me if I can or not. Right. Okay, next slide, please. So Gina, so the poster image, the woman screaming. Again, that was another one. I think a lot of people I spoke to kind of thought she should be in the punk room, but this was way before she was a punk. So this she made in 1978 or 9 when she was living in Sheffield, and as she said to me, she was taking too many drugs and going out with really dodgy men, and she made this scream work, and she was screaming because she wanted something different. That scream just and very shortly after moved to London, moved into a squad and started the Raincoats. Next slide. And the Happy Flashers, kind of iconic work in the back about women's access to childcare. One of the most depressing things about the show was that literally nothing's changed. And actually I think things are worse in terms of childcare if you look at this work. Oh, so I'm going to talk about this very quickly. This is OAD. So this banner here was an object that I borrowed from the Black Cultural Centre, and I think it's one of the most interesting things in the show. So quite often with a show like this, you don't see everything properly because you're like seeing it under a table or on a bed or balanced on something, and this was in their archive, but it had just been folded up, and so we kind of unstretched it to take a picture and then put it back in its case and borrowed it, and then we had it mounted for the show. So OAD formed in I think about 1978, and they were the Organisation of Women of Africa and African Descent, and they had a conference in 1980 where they were discussing political blackness and like should they extend their remit to think about Asian women as well, so like brown and black women, which of course was a huge topic, and you know today we wouldn't use the term political blackness, but it was a very important kind of moment of discussion. And they had this conference and they decided actually yes, so the conference notes were all in here about this decision, and they changed the name to the Organisation of Women of Asian and African Descent. And what I loved is that this, so you can see they've added a new piece of textile and drawn a South Asian woman,
and then they've Tipexed out this lady's face and made her look South Asian. And it's just such a beautiful thing to me, because it's like at the moment, you know, when you try and have discussions about issues of race or class or trans issues or any of those things, we're in an environment where it's so volatile and so aggressive, and there's no kind of way to just sit and have a chat and work things through. And this for me just shows women, like they had strong opinions, they would have had a big fight about it, but in the end, worked something out, Tipexed over the banner. I love that, I just think it's gorgeous. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. I've gone on for ages. Posters. So on the right, the See Red poster. There were See Red posters in every room. So See Red, a collective of women artists. So everything they made was co-authored. They would share a print studio, and they'd come up with an idea or something they were interested in and make these posters. And they cover 1970 to 1990, and yeah, had them in every room. They're amazing. There's a book of them that you can get if you're interested. Next slide, please. Oh, Bondage Up Yours, of course, in homage to polystyrene from X-ray specs. Next slide, please. So this room was really, this was like probably at 1970, it was really loose, like 1977-ish to 1984 or 5-ish, mostly because the neonators bullied me into changing, like getting their work in and loosening the dates. But I wanted to think about Thatcher getting into power and the rebellion against that. So of course Thatcher gets her first job in 1970 as a minister, and then in 1974 becomes education minister and steals all our milk, and then in 1979 becomes prime minister. So all of this work is kind of around that moment, and it's women going out, having a great time, having a terrible time, having sex, thinking about sex in different ways, being musicians, just kind of really rebelling. And interesting for me, which I didn't expect this, this is the first room where you see the work of women of colour. So this is feminist work. This is Polly Desai. This is Joy Gregory. So Joy Gregory, I think a lot of people will know her work. Extraordinary photographer. Not known for an interest in punk, but because I'd spent that time in the archives, you're able to like ask those questions, and she was like, yeah, I love punk, and found these two photographs that had never been shown called Roses and Razor Blades. This is Jill Westwood, who kind of worked with the neonators quite a lot, but was her practice was as a dominatrix for about a year, and she ran a latex store in London and made fetish wear, and she was in a band called Fistfuck, quite brilliantly titled. Del Grace Volcano, who was photographing lesbian punks around London, some videos of punks. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then in this room as well, so lots of punk archive from a woman called Lucy Toothpaste, who ran Rock Against Racism and Rock Against Sexism, and was heavily involved in them. And I again managed to find 3 or 4 punk zines that were written by women, no male zines. Caroline Coon, who was heavily involved in punk, she managed the Clash for a while, and these are paintings from when she worked as a sex worker. And Jill Posner, brilliant photographs, really kind of iconic images of her and her friends would live in kind of lesbian squats in South London and would go out and would graffiti advertising that was sexist, and then take photographs of it. So I've also just heard we got them into the Tate collection as well, so that's really pretty. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, there you go. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So, Green and Women Are Everywhere was really the most straightforward kind of room in the show, and maybe a little bit of respite between 2 quite intense rooms. And I think Greenham, I don't know how much there was to look at really, because Greenham to me is just common sense, as I think it is to most women, like kind of, fighting against male, military might. But what really interested me about Greenham was that everyone I spoke to was affected by Greenham, even if they hadn't been. So there were, some women I met would have gone for a year, some stayed for 2 nights, but it had this really profound effect. And I think the effect it seemed to have for a lot of them was that it showed them a non-heteronormative way of living. So it showed a lot of women that they could be lesbians, that they could live in a field with loads of kids and loads of women. They didn't need that house, that family structure, all of those things that we were told, and certainly that we were told at that time that you needed. I think it offered a form of freedom, even if that was just in the imagination, even if the lived experience was muddy and horrible and cold, there was something about it, the magic that it held for people. So we had a lot of film from Greenham, and we had this brilliant Margaret Harrison work. So this is basically what the fence would have looked like, of course not with a mirror behind it, but you know, it's a section of fence and then covered in clothes. Also thinking about that as like a site of performance, and thinking about the action Embrace the Base, which was in 1981 when 30,000 women held hands around the camp, and there were photographs of that by format as well. Next slide please. Very quickly, this is this incredible, huge shaped canvas by a woman called Sam Ainsley. And Sam, if you know of any Turner Prize winners from Glasgow, just got another one the other day, and Jaslyn Kaur, they will have been taught in some way by this woman because she co-founded the environmental arts course in Glasgow. So every important artist from Glasgow came through her teaching, but no one knows who she is. She started to have more shows now, but they're monumental and glorious and wonderful. And then these posters on the right, they're a big part of my PhD. They really blew my mind. So they're by a group called Sister Seven, and they are a poster exhibition. So this thing that I hadn't even conceived of before, where women would make exhibitions on paper. So this includes images, poems, performances that you could hire, and then they're laminated, put in a box and sent around the country. So you get it and you just tap it up on the wall. Done. No galleries, no commercial bullshit, no insurance, no framing. It's just genius. And this is one that's about Green Common. And yeah, anti-nuclear action. Next slide, please. Lots of fabulous stuff. We didn't have enough space to talk about miners' strikes in any detail, which was obviously a huge shame, but there was archival elements there. Next slide.
Actually, can I point out, including
Please.
a song by Alison Lloyd?
Yes, sorry, of
I know.
course. So these are 4 photographs by Alison Lloyd, miners' works, because of course she was heavily involved in socialist activism and all kinds of activism across her life, and she made these brilliant, she's dressed up as an angel in support of the miners. Badges. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. So, there were the architecture of Tate in that space, which is the space I wanted, meant that the next 2 rooms, one was quite small and then one was quite big, and it's quite a lot of toing and froing about how I'd manage that space. But in the end, I was speaking to one of the advisors, Marlene, and we agreed that it was one space, so it's considered as one room, but it has 2 different kind of tones to it. So the first smaller section of Black Women Time Now is very much about that early 80s moment and about the really radical activism of women of colour in the face of the extraordinary racism of the UK at that moment. I mean, and this moment as well. You know, you just had exactly the same thing happen. Very terrifying. But, you know, in 1979, you've got fascists often on the streets in Southall. You've got Margaret Thatcher introducing stop and search laws. You've got young black boys particularly being kind of siphoned off into special educational needs schools when there was absolutely no reason for it to happen. And you have extreme police violence and things like Broadwater Farm and the murder of Cynthia Jarrett, and then the shooting, kind of naming and later death responsibility of the police of Terry Groves, which of course are also instigating uprisings up and down the country. So that is the kind of timbre of that moment. And this work here by Levena Himid is one of her earliest works, and it's called Dog Star. And this work, so it's a young man and his erect penis is an angry dog, and she talks about this being the kind of men that would intimidate her friends, the skinheads that would walk down the street with dogs trying to scare her friends. Next slide, please.
Doesn't like it. Interval.
The interval, yeah, probably so the other thing that was happening at that 80s the moment. So you've got the political situation, which I'm sure most people are highly aware of, but you also have a real kind of change happening in the art world. So in 1981, there's a conference in Wolverhampton called the first convention. It's like the National Black Artists Convention, and it's organised by, among other people, Marlene Smith, people like Key Piper, Marlene Smith, and they're like 18, 19, and they hold this conference, and they're talking about the state of black arts in the UK, and the whole thing is recorded. You can hear it on SoundCloud if you Google it, and it's fascinating because you hear Claudette Johnson, Turner Prize nominee, talking about her practice and talking about, at the age of 18, her need to foreground the bodies of women of colour and to kind of resuscitate them in art history and give them a place. And then you start to hear all the men in the room just getting really bored and kind of talking over her, and it like just being very disrespectful. Then you hear Lubena Himid and Marlene Smith basically saying, fine, we'll go to another room. And they go to a different room and they start talking together. And a lot of people have talked about that as being the moment when the black women from the Black British art movement kind of start to come together and form those relationships that then turn into the kind of movement that we see. And then out of that, you have Lubena curating 3 really important shows. So she curates Black Women Time Now, 5 Black Women Artists, and The Thin Black Line. So there was 83, 83, and then, thank you, and then 1985. So this is early Claudette Johnson, and this is Marlene's, I shall talk about that in a minute. And so you have those 3 shows by Lubena, and actually the show she made with the ICA, Thin Black Line, they're doing a whole, she's basically recurating that show next year, which would be amazing at the ICA, with a new book and loads of things. But again, what's fascinating is the art world will tell you that that's the first show of feminist black art in the UK, and it's not. Actually, hold that thought. No, don't actually. Next slide, please. It's not. So the first show by women artists of colour in the UK, feminist. I should say that. Of course, there's work by women of colour in different traditions and modernism and all sorts of things, but in terms of feminist art. So in 1981, Bajan Hunjan with Chyla Berman curates a show in Greenwich called 4 Indian Women Artists, and that is the first feminist Black British art show in the UK. So we kind of, hint at that work as well. So actually go back a sec. Thank you. The other thing that was really important to me was not to get hung up on the original. So kind of curators quite often get obsessed with like the aura of the vintage print and kind of that stuff, and I think it's absolute nonsense because it's such a privilege. It's generally only white male artists that manage to keep an archive intact throughout their lives. Women, people of colour, queer people often have to move a lot, they have precarious jobs, you know, you've got a mouldy shed where you're keeping things, and this work about Cherry Rose had been destroyed, so I'd only seen one photograph of it. So it's Cherry Rose who was at home in Brixton, the police came looking for her son who'd done nothing, and in the intervening kind of conversation they managed to shoot her in her own home, and she was disabled and then died years later. It was now a monument to her in Brixton, Windrush Square. And Marlene had made this because her mum was a cleaner and used to come home at the same kind of time, so she'd just come home. So it says, my mother opens the door at 7 a.m, she is not bulletproof, and this is made of J cloths, her body's made of J cloths. So that was remade, and I'm very glad it was remade. That wouldn't have happened 10 or 15 years ago, I don't think. It would have kind of been considered, you know, you don't do that, but I think it's important. And Tate just bought it, so that's brilliant. Next slide, please. So again, this room's still very much about rage. You've got Bajan, you know, leaning over her fence, this incredible, a lot of the South Asian women artists I spoke to, they were often pushing against this notion of them as meek, you know, the kind of perception that they didn't have a voice, or they weren't political, they weren't, and I love this, just, actually we bought that as well, so that's very good. And then you have the iconic Housewives with steak knives by Shutba Biswas, which is this big one on the right, which is the goddess Kali, and she's holding a machete. She has a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi down here, which refers to her kind of education with Griselda Pollock, and she's holding a severed head of a white male politician and has a necklace of white male politicians' heads. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. It's also about the same size as Shutterput. Like Shutterput is absolutely tiny. And again, what's really fascinating about this show is that so much of this work is degree show work. And I've been talking to people about that recently, and someone said to me so insightfully that that's the last time working class people have access to studio space. So of course, then everything gets smaller. And then on the video monitor there's Monica Toom's road works, they're really iconic work, responding to the uprisings in Brixton of her, walking around with dog harness tied to her feet. And I saw that really recently. It was shown in a butcher shop in Brixton, which was gorgeous. It was like the perfect viewing space. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so this is the second half of the room, which I wanted to be much more joyful, because I think institutions often are really obsessed with black pain and with kind of constantly pushing victimhood or survivorhood, or just, framing in that way. And I was thinking about, next slide please, next slide, Rita Keegan, thank you. So Rita Keegan is one of the most overlooked British artists I think we have. So she co-founded Brixton Art Gallery in 1981 or 2, which did the most amazing intersectional feminist group shows for years. And she started the Women of Colour Index at Goldsmiths, works at Goldsmiths for a long time, worked on the Arts Council collection. She's just amazing. And she always uses her image or the image of her family. And when I asked her why, she said, in a thick New York accent, because when young black girls go to the gallery, I want them to see themselves. And so that was very much what we thought about for that second room, was thinking about family, thinking about representing collectivity and joy in black experience, but also about really inserting black women in art history. So if you go to the next slide, this is a really good example. So this is another Rita Keegan, and then these two works. So this is Marlene Smith again, and it's called Art History. It's owned by Birmingham. And it's a vase that her mum made before she died that's set in sugar, starch, and it's got this kind of offering, this bouquet of flowers, and then these 4 images at the side in clip frames are of black creative women who'd inspired her. And actually 2 of them are in the show, so Brenda Agard and Simone Alexander were also in the room. So that's about the lineage of art history for black women. And then this one, I absolutely love. So this is by Stella Datsy, who's an artist that I paid for a bit of consultation from as well, because she co-wrote or co-edited the book Heart of the Race in 1985. So if you haven't read any of the literature from the 80s by feminists, that is the one I would start with. It's a collection of kind of narrative interviews and texts by women of colour who are working in the UK, and it is the most depressing thing you'll ever read about their experiences of work and just the extraordinary racism they experience every single day. And this painting was on the cover of that book, and I never even wondered who painted it. I think I'd assumed it was Sonia Boyce, and I hadn't really thought about it. And then I was in Stella's house, and she said, "Oh, do you want to see the cover thing?" And I got it out of the attic, and it had never been shown. And it's just this most amazing image. So it's called Motherland, and it's this woman looking over, what is Battersea, but could also be the Turbine Hall and could be Tate Modern. And the sea is blue at the front when it's close to Motherland, and the closer it gets to the UK, it is dark and kind of miserable, just gorgeous. And the book was republished in 2018 and was like a massive success again. And I like to think that a lot of people will have recognised that image and felt comfortable in that space. Next slide, please. Don't have time to talk about that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So, no such thing as society is, of course, a phrase by Margaret Thatcher. She wrote it, she said it when she was interviewed by Women's Own in the late 80s. And so this last room looks at the kind of the late 80s moment, and it's split into